which are really an asset for Ukraine, function very well again for the Central Europe and Southeastern European market with the warehouse regime and short hauls. This has really proved to be an important asset for Ukraine. The other point is it's not just Ukraine where we've seen the changes, but we've also seen significant changes, better interconnectivity in Central Europe, talking about Poland and north-south corridors. We have seen the LNG terminals in Krik and other terminals in Greece coming on stream. And this has really changed the flows in these markets with TANAP and TAP coming online and working, plus Turkstream with a second leg into the Southeastern European market functioning. And this all in all has very much changed the gas flows. Of course, it has on the one hand reduced the necessary transit through Ukraine, but it has also opened up opportunities for Ukraine to import gases, to also in future import a gas from exactly the region of Southeastern Europe and so on. The two major issues that keep standing there are, to me, how much gas needs to be imported from Russian entry points to maintain all of these options that I described. How much pressure do we need in the grid? Plus, if we talk about the long-term perspective for gas transit from east to west through Ukraine, what is the long-term perspective? What does this mean for also competition? Will we see competition of Central Asian gas? That very much depends on Russia's choice, or gas release programs on the eastern entry points. And will European companies agree to that, which we still see a lot of question marks behind? But the major point why I'm raising this issue of the long-term perspective is the point of decommissioning of parts of the gas transport system, plus repurposing it for hydrogen. And this is the major other point that I would like to make with regard to molecules. Of course, Ukraine has huge capacity and opportunities to produce green gases, synthetic gases, and hydrogen. With regard to all sorts of low carbon and climate friendly hydrogen. I also see Ukraine basically in theory very well placed to make pilot projects for a transitioning or a decarbonisation in the gas value chain, because it has this crucial position in this wider Eastern European gas market, with its assets that I described, parallel strings of pipes, storages, a potential to start CCS, to start storing CO2, plus, for example, importing natural gas from Russia, producing blue hydrogen, and then exporting it to Europe. So the stepping stones are there, and there's even the opportunity in theory to leapfrog and modernize. And this brings me to my second point, which is a much shorter one, because you mentioned that already. With regard to leapfrog and modernize, of course, we have the big issue of coal exit and the big issue of the just transition in the Donbas regions and others. And there, the opportunities are also quite clear, because we have 33 of the coal mines are in state property. We have the whole scheme of fossil fuel subsidies, but there are mechanisms, there are levers to really transit. And what is also interesting is we are talking, if we talk about the energy transition, about energy/industrial policies. And Ukraine is among the 5 largest global producers of steel and iron. So we could think about combining energy and industrial strategies to greening the production of, well, steel and iron. And my final point is, and this is the one that I think is mostly overlooked and geopolitically completely underrated compared to natural gas, compared to gas. And this is the big endeavor of connecting and synchronizing the Ukrainian electricity grid with the continental European grid. So Ukrenergo with the ENTSO-E grid by 2025. And this comes with huge challenges, not only technically, economically, but also politically politically. And there we have the whole dimension of hybrid threats. We are really talking about a critical infrastructure. So to summarize, looking to the time, we have a huge potential. If we look to that on paper, I presented the factual logics for a closer cooperation in energy transformation, which really means moving away from the traditional G7 approach of 2014, where we talked about traditional gas supply of security and contingency. And it's now really, I think, the time for a transatlantic cooperation to push Ukraine into an energy transition and make it a valuable and integral part of the Green Deal and the climate neutral Europe. But of course, and this is my final point, the prerequisites for that is, of course, a reliable regulatory framework and a stable political framework, plus ongoing market reforms. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirsten. Yes, we have for outlining the potential. And if all goes well, we have a reliable, regulatory framework. The security, the energy security and the security is likely to increase as well as a modernization. Now that will be now the discussion how this will happen. Now I should also add that Thorsten Wöllert has just reminded us and reminded me that the Ukraine's draft, NDC, National Determined Contribution, foresees climate neutrality by 2060. And this has already been, the 2060 date has already been enshrined in the 2030 National Economic Development Strategy. So important to get the facts right. Let's go, Kirsten, we'll come back to these points. Let's go maybe to Ed. Ed, you have heard what Kirsten was saying. Hydrogen, blue hydrogen, lots of potential. The gas dimension is changing, but also just transition, leapfrogging. How does that sound to you? And that's one part of the question. And the other one is, how does the EU or the US, sorry, how does the US climate and energy policy comes in all this, also in light of the broader geopolitical situation now? Ed, I ask a lot of questions and you get 7 to 10 minutes. Pick the ones you wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for allowing me to join this large European discussion and lend a perspective from across the pond. It all sounds good to me, Christian. Maybe what I can add is give you a little bit of perspective, particularly for European audience, about what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Washington, the remaining differences that I see between US and European policy, and what all of this means for Ukraine. Let me start with the US. Just to state the obvious, we have a new administration which is trying to steer a U-turn on climate policy after Trump. If anything, the Biden administration current policy rhetoric appears to be more progressive or more radical, if depending on your point of view, than what Biden said during the campaign. However, we have to remember that he and his party has razor-thin majorities in both houses of Congress, which restricts bold legislative action on climate policy. We have seen that the use, but also the limitations of administrative and regulatory actions. We saw that under Obama, we saw that under Trump. These are not permanent measures that can be overturned later if there's a change in the political situation. Perhaps this is the reason for the urgency on the part of the Biden administration, because in 2 years, those majorities in the House of Representatives and the US Senate may not be there. So if they're going to do something, then there is a sense that they have to do it sooner rather than later. Climate policy will remain a topic of heated partisan debate. But nevertheless, the intention of the administration is clear. And they will likely look at international agreements as a way to support and solidify the domestic policy direction. Success is not guaranteed given the delicate political balance. I think it's important to point out that even with better alignment on climate policy, there are still substantive differences between the United States and Europe. For one thing, the obvious availability of domestic hydrocarbon resources, especially after the shale revolution, which is seen in the US as an asset for energy security. The lack of domestic hydrocarbon resources, indeed declining production in Europe, has always been seen as a liability for energy security. Thus, the energy transition for decarbonization is seen in Europe as an enhancing energy security if green energy can be sourced either from Europe or neighboring regions near Europe. For the United States, and perhaps for Europe also, there will be winners and losers in the energy transition, including among our different states. I assume this will also happen in Europe among different member states. To a certain extent, these differences will drive the political debate on both sides of the Atlantic. American faith in innovation and market solutions, even if those technologies don't yet exist or are not yet proven, is another difference, I think, between us. Europe appears to have more faith in administrative solutions and government mandates. You can think of it as American optimism and European realism, depending on your point of view, but you may not be able to tell that after you just heard me and after Kirsten's optimistic outlook. These differences will come into sharp relief, in my mind, on carbon price. With the ETS now trading at 50 euros per ton, there's no wonder that Europe wants to talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The US will see such moves as being premature for the global trading system. What does this all mean for Ukraine? I have more to say than we have time. So let me just highlight a few points. From my point of view, as someone who has worked on or observed energy in Ukraine on and off for 20 years, almost all of its energy security challenges are internal and not external. Here's a country that has resources to be energy self-sufficient, including vast potential for renewable energy production. But 30 years of delayed transition to market economy has saddled Ukraine with wasteful energy use, underinvestment, and energy corruption. This has not changed as much as one would like to have seen since 2014. There's still a lack of political vision, coherent strategy, and capacity to execute sound policy. Just last week, we saw the appointment of a fourth energy minister in Ukraine in less than 2 years. There continues to be a preference for manual control over market. The electricity market is very close to collapse with billions of dollars of circular debt. The same holds true but also applies in the gas market. Ukraine has resumed importing electricity from Russia and Belarus. There's way too much focus when we talk about Ukraine on gas. Ukraine is highly dependent on petroleum product imports, and most of that comes from Russia and Belarus. So Ukrainian leaders have to choose, and I'm afraid that they have not seen the urgency, particularly that CBAM would bring as Ukraine deals with its largest trading partner in the European Union. As I said, I've overextended my time, so I will stop here. I hope we'll have more time to discuss details on Ukraine energy security. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. No, you haven't. You stayed right in time, Ed, but we'll certainly pick up some of these points. I understand you correctly. This is very much the analytical part. I'm sure, Ed, you have some sort of prescription somewhere in your armory, and we'll come back to that. You have heard, we come to Luis from IRENA. Luis, Ed has mentioned the potential, so has Kirsten. There is huge potential in a broader energy, in an integrated energy sector perspective, but also on renewables, etc. Luis, you have done a lot of analysis in the IRENA. What happens? How can you make this potential really bring to fruition, and how much further integration will there be needed into the EU, CSEC, Western Balkan, whatever framework you want to use, market? Integration is going on, but what else will be needed? Luis, please.
Yes, thank you, Christian, very much for the invitation to IRENA, and hello everyone in the webinar. Maybe for those joining that are not familiar with IRENA, we are a multilateral organization with 163 member countries, and our mission is to advance the renewables agenda in our members, supporting them in a transition towards sustainable energy. And for us, Southeast Europe has been a very important region. On the one hand, it's facing serious challenges. Ed mentioned some just a few minutes ago. On the other hand, there's a lot of potential for a transition towards a sustainable energy. So with this in mind, we started an initiative in 2017 to actually work in the region. And as part of that initiative, we've done several analyses, and maybe the one that triggered your invitation to this webinar was the study that we realized put online last year in September. We released in September. It included 18 countries, which are part of the Central Europe and Southeast Europe Connectivity Initiative. And in that study, we looked at the potential for renewables in a 2030 timeframe, and it included Ukraine. And our conclusion of that study was that we thought is realistic that Ukraine moves from a 5% renewable share today to a 24% renewables share in 2030 in a cost-effective fashion. So that, let's say, in the short term. The discussion is about energy security. In IRENA, we look at energy security not necessarily as a core objective, but as a positive side benefit of transitions towards sustainable energy. And in Ukraine, energy security today is actually, as Ed was mentioning before, is not so much about gas, but about gas, about oil, and even about coal. And by definition, sustainable energy system is about getting those three energy carriers out of the equation. So in other words, we think the strategy to pursue security of supply could be exactly the same strategy as to pursue several other worthwhile policy objectives, like the modernization of energy systems, ensuring competitiveness of the energy sector, reducing air pollution, and created jobs domestically rather than shipping resources to oil and gas producing countries, by the way, while meeting the Paris Agreement. Now, obviously, the question is Ukraine in a position to rely strongly on renewable energy? And I would just like to give a sense of the scale of this. In 2030, we estimate that Ukraine will consume about 600 terawatt hours of energy in the whole energy system. So not only power, but also fuels for heat and fuels for transport. Just the cost-effective potential of wind onshore alone can deliver that amount of energy. If we add wind offshore potential, that roughly doubles. And I still haven't started talking about solar photovoltaics and bioenergy, which could also bring those quantities much further. So that the answer of whether Ukraine can rely on renewables in the long term is a resounding yes. The question is how to get there. And we see three key strategies to get there. Let's say not so much from a policy perspective, although we could also discuss policy later, but let's say from an energy systems perspective, what should be the objective of policy? And those three pillars of the strategy are first, decisive deployment of renewables in the power sector. And the reason for this is that renewable technologies for power generation have achieved cost competitiveness. We see them now consistently being deployed at cheaper prices than fossil technology and nuclear technology worldwide. And they still have room for further technological deployment and further cost reductions. And global markets are recognizing this. And we've seen in the last 6 years that renewables have outpaced fossil and nuclear combined in the deployment of new capacity. And actually last year, in the middle of the pandemic, renewables accounted for 4 out of 5 megawatts installed worldwide. So we think that solar and wind in particular will be the core technologies in the power sector, but also more broadly in the energy system. And by the way, these deployments are without need of economical support anymore in many cases. And actually, if I can go one step further, we are seeing increasingly in some markets that it is cheaper to install new solar or wind capacity than keep running existing fossil plants. So just the marginal cost of running those plants. The second pillar of this strategy is looking at everything that is not power, because we spend way too much time talking about power, and electricity is only 1/5 of the energy that we consume. So the second pillar is a decisive strategy to electrify heat and transport services in the country. Why electrification, you may ask? And the first reason for that is that electrification, if done in a smart way, delivers very large efficiency improvements, which is, by the way, another challenge, particularly in Ukraine. Both electric vehicles and electric heating systems can deliver the same energy service as the fossil counterparts using 1/3 of the energy. And this doesn't receive enough attention. We spend way too much time talking just about the power sector. And then finally, the third pillar, I would say, is the use of bioenergy. There are a number of applications that cannot be delivered with electric technology, and bioenergy can play an important role there. And Ukraine has a very large untapped sustainable potential for bioenergy. There's one sector in which it could become very useful, which is district heating, which accounts for 1/5 of the heat in the country. And for other applications, like, for instance, helping to integrate a power system with solar and wind, providing firm capacity. So that's the third pillar. So summarizing, the potential is there for sure, and a combination of adoption of renewables in the power sector, electrification of everything that is today not power, and smart use of the bioenergy resources of the country could go a long way to bringing Ukraine to much more energy secure energy system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We can expand on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this. I mean, just two small points. I was a bit surprised on your strong link or a strong stress on electricity and heating. I mean, it's clear electrification is energy efficiency at its best, going by itself. But unless I'm wrong, the building stock may not be terribly well insulated. So you would see quite a flexibility challenge. And if you link it to transport as well, that will, create some major issue for grid reinforcement, et cetera, and just also markets for flexibility. And as we have heard before, the market framework seems not to be in place already to do with this. And I would also like to thank you for stressing the bioenergy. Very often we keep forgetting the bioenergy. Many of the countries outside Europe have quite a bit of potential there, which can be reaped. But I would just be curious to see how you see this electrification of heat and transport play out already in a 2030 perspective, I understood. But then we have about, if I'm getting the number right, 24% of renewables.
Yes, that's a very good question, and indeed a challenge for the country. 100% agreed that efficiency needs to come, let's say, the efficiency of the building envelope and the building stock needs to come at the same time as electrification. On the other hand, electrification, if planned appropriately, can also help, rather than being a liability to the power system, can be an asset. If digital technologies are adopted to charge electric vehicles or to operate heat pumps in buildings, that can also be an asset rather than a liability. But 100% agree that the building stock needs to be renovated in line with the transformation. With regards to the timeline to 2030, of course, in our analysis, let's say that 24% is not only about electrification, it's about several options. It's about power sector, it's about district heating, it's about several things. And let's say we understand that the markets do not transform immediately. Markets have inertias, and obviously, if there's no heat pump market today in Ukraine, it needs time to develop. So that's also taken into account.
Thank you, Luis. We come to Matteo. Matteo, Luis mentioned 24% potential for renewables. That leaves us still 75% of something else, which is to be discussed as well. But I would also like to see your assessment and how the European Commission is sort of looking at this, and what would then be your priorities in order to start this transition, or maybe even to accelerate to as much as possible. As we have all seen, there's a huge potential there, and we all struggle with how to reap that. Matteo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian, and hello everybody, and thank you for having me as a panelist in such an interesting webinar. Just from the onset, I feel a bit compelled to add, let's say, a disclaimer that not necessarily in my remarks in each and every aspect I can be considered to necessarily reflect the official position of the European Commission. This being said, let me start by recalling that the EU has a deep and comprehensive cooperation with Ukraine in the energy field, and this mainly takes place in the framework of a dedicated energy annex which we have under the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, but also via an additional instrument, which is a Memorandum of Understanding on a Strategic Energy Partnership, which has been signed in 2016. And basically in this framework, most recently, after the latest ministerial meeting in December between our Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, and the then, by the way, acting Minister of Energy, Ms. Buzlavets an annual work plan for 2021, and this memorandum of understanding was agreed. So detailing basically the next steps of measures and reforms which we expect Ukraine to pursue and finalize with our support. And in this juncture, I should also underline the fact that Ukraine has recently also highlighted its interest to be more involved in the European Green Deal. And for that reason, a political dialogue on the Green Deal was launched by the Prime Minister of Ukraine and the Vice President for Climate of the Commission, Timmermans, in February. And we believe it is important to make sure that such a dialogue and the existing sectoral initiatives, such as the one we have on energy, which I described briefly before, reinforce basically and do not supersede each other. So in this context, the interplay which I see between the drive towards the decarbonization and the long-term energy security of Ukraine has two key dimensions, which I would like to highlight in my brief remarks. On the one hand, the prospects for market integration with the EU, and on the other hand, the long-term role of natural gas. And with respect to the first aspect, we are urging Ukraine not to lower the ambition in the existing reform commitments which have been defined at sectoral level. So it is important, and this was also in that respect, I would echo also some of the remarks by previous panelists. It is important that Ukrainian authorities do not backtrack on energy market reforms, both as far as gas and electricity are concerned. And functioning electricity and gas markets are a backbone for the energy transition and a basis for market integration with the EU. And this does not only concern technical standards and legal approximation, but also the proper implementation of competitive and market standards. The first panelist mentioned also the discussion on the synchronization of the Ukraine system, and there definitely, I mean, this is one important, let's say, issue for discussion we have with Ukraine. Of course, we know that integration does not necessarily coincide with the full synchronization, and we would just add some word of caution on not setting already some definite timing for the conclusion, the finalization of this integration or synchronization process, because indeed, like I just mentioned, this does not only concern implementation of engineering standards, but also the whole implementation and the whole making sure that market and competitive and market outcomes are there. As regards gas market, the progress on the setup of such a market have been undeniable. We had the unbundling of the gas transmission system operator, which has been certified as such by the Energy Community Secretariat. And there were also other encouraging developments, some of those Kirsten has mentioned at the beginning. For example, the fact that domestic gas demand is now being fulfilled through a combination of reverse flows from the EU neighbors, but also domestic production rather than direct import from Russia. And also more recently, the use of Ukraine gas storage by Ukraine companies. As of 1st April of 2021, we observe a 16 BCM, billion cubic meter stock of natural gas in the storage system, which is the highest in the last 10 years. And there is also a trend towards growing investments in the domestic gas production that we are observing via, for example, licenses which have been granted for new gas fields exploration to both Ukrgaz Vidobuvania, which supplies Naftogaz, but also private producers such as DTEC. However, the path has not yet been completed, and we see that a competitive retail segment of the gas market is still to be created. And we also observe the number of government measures and interventions which may potentially jeopardize the reform achievements. These include, for example, changes to the ministries exerting control over the gas, but also electricity transmission system operators. And this is something on which, together with the Energy Community Secretariat, we are working closely with Ukrainian partners to solve any potential issues for the unbundling and other aspects. But also, and this was already mentioned by another panelist, the recent dismissal of the CEO of Naftogaz raises concern as regards the implementation of internationally recognized standards of corporate governance without undue political interference. And we also had the government instruction recently to proceed to a gas release to households at a predetermined price, which again signals still some hiccups in the finalization of a competitive gas market. But the issue is not limited to the implementation of market standards, and there we come to the second dimension, which I would like to highlight and which I have mentioned earlier, meaning the long-term prospects for gas in our common path to the decarbonisation. And in the EU, we plan to gradually replace natural gas with electrification, and for hard-to-abate sectors such as industry or transports, also renewable and decarbonized gases, including hydrogen. And in the course of 2021, the EU will present a revision of its package of gas regulations, which is mainly geared toward enabling the setup of a market for clean gas. And it is clear that Ukraine, that is also defining now a more ambitious nationally determined contribution for the Paris emission targets, and if current proposals are finally adopted, indeed heading towards net climate neutrality by 2060, like it has been already highlighted, we'll have also then to consider a path toward gas decarbonization, including the need to align to EU steps given the strong market integration. And that inevitably implies that when the 5-year gas transit agreement with Russia, which was a key successful milestone which has been reached in 2019 with the Commission acting as facilitator, and which, by the way, has so far been implemented in an orderly fashion with around 55 billion cubic meters of Russian gas, which has been transited via the gas transmission system of Ukraine in 2020, will come to expiry in 2024. The context for gas, as already been highlighted also by other panelists, will be fundamentally different from when the current agreement was negotiated in 2018 and 2019. And therefore, any possible future negotiation for the renewal of such agreement will have to be assessed closer to the termination date of the current transit agreement and weighed against those broader trends. So mainly the actual weight that natural gas will still have at the time, and the role, of course, of decarbonized gases. And in that respect, the hydrogen strategy, which the EU has adopted, recognizes Ukraine as a priority partner, and its entities, companies already cooperate with European partners in the EU Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And we also have evidence based on contacts we're having with the EU industries that there is interest, for example, to join Ukraine partners to invest in green hydrogen production from renewable energy, for example, in Western Ukraine, and export it westward via the existing or repurposed pipelines. Vice President Timmermans gave prominence to hydrogen in his meeting with the Ukraine Prime Minister in February. And he also mentioned the aspirational objective of 40 plus 40 gigawatt of green hydrogen production capacity.
Matteo, you have used up 9 minutes, around 9 minutes, yeah.
Okay, I will be as quick as possible in concluding. So I mentioned this 40 plus 40, with 40 gigawatt being installed in the EU neighborhood, so possibly part of it also in Ukraine. And let me end my remarks just by recalling that natural gas is still considered anyway an important bridge fuel within the energy transition. And in that respect, the call to gas switching is a sensible transitional step, all the more so in a country like Ukraine with the legacy of coal industry and a significant coal share still in the energy mix. And let me just conclude in that respect by saying that the Commission, together with other partners, precisely on that specific aspect, has launched at the end of last year an initiative for core regions in transition in the Western Balkans and Ukraine, which is adapted to the local context, include also technical assistance and financial support. And we believe it's potential should be used to the full as a fundamental step to facilitate the decarbonization of Ukraine's economy. And I would conclude my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Ludmila has been able to join us by now. I don't know exactly how much you have been following of the discussions. Maybe I would like just to quickly recap the main points for you to comment if you wish to do so. Kirsten was outlining the huge potential and the importance also of the synchronization with the EU electricity grid. Then Ed was discussing the EU, the US, what the US climate and energy policy, the different viewpoints, but also then trying to get on the convergence. But he saw a lot of internal difficulties, while it was also mentioned that in principle Ukraine would be an energy sufficient, self-sufficient country when you look at all the resources that exist, including renewable ones. And then you have heard Matteo, and we all been discussing, how to get going, how to move towards reaping all this potential. There is, and I'm sure you've been discussing a lot also with European, American colleagues, et cetera, so the points that have been made here may not be entirely new to you. I'm sure they won't be. So Ludmila, thank you all for joining us to this
Thank you for inviting me.
And it's a great pleasure. So please just give us a bit your take on all these points, and how could we get going in this situation to move towards this decarbonization. Please.
So thanks once again for inviting and for fascinating presentations. I've heard most of them. I had a bit of a technical issue connecting at the beginning. What would be worth mentioning is that Ukraine is a young democracy and even a younger market economy. We're just making first very cautious steps in the direction of actually bringing our legislation and the processes inside our governmental organizations and different regulators in line with best market practices that obviously we learn a lot from more robust and more developed economies such as the European Union or the United States. So as you know, from 2019, we're all trying our hardest to figure out how to set all the market regulations in place so that we don't see anymore such a wild market behavior. And the situation is a bit better on the gas market. It's extremely critical on the electricity market. So our number one and my number one goal right now is to first vote through the parliament and then go through all the necessary steps for the implementation of remit regulations for our electricity and gas market. That will, in my assessment, allow us to save up to 25 billion hryvnias in the system, because that is the approximate assessment of the cash gap that appears on the market due to all the abuses of competition and all the trading of air. We've seen different manipulations between several market segments. Obviously, another very important area, which is not related to the law itself, but on the lower level of capability, basically, of our regulator and the authority of the regulator, is to put all their documents in line with the law on electricity market and law on the gas market, because that's not always the case. And basically those gaps that exist, they create initially the possibility for for market abuses. On the good news side, the remit is going to be voted hopefully until the end of this parliamentary session, so until the end of June. At least, a lot of forces in the government and in the parliament and beyond are working on this very actively at the moment. And the law has passed the committee hearing for the first hearing, so then there will be a second one in a couple of months' time, or probably a month and a half. So the objective is to vote this law as soon as possible and launch the process of stabilizing markets. Now, I think one of the speakers mentioned, and this is by far one of the biggest problems for the Ukrainian gas market, is our heating system. And the absolute lack of market relationship on that segment as such. Which creates a situation that Naftogaz or any other gas supplier cannot supply at the market price gas to the heating stations that are all communal, very old, very obsolete, Soviet type heating plants working either on natural gas or in some regions on coal. So that is the area that was untouched for the moment, and that is a source of around 100 billion hryvnias of debts for gas from the so-called Teplokомунэнерго, so the heating stations, to Naftogaz as the supplier of last hope. That problem also needs to be resolved, and we need to look at a broader perspective of how we can actually transform heating system. And I agree with the colleagues who mentioned that electrification should become one of the key milestones for the strategy of the whole energy sector, not just talking about electricity or gas market, but as a whole. There is also a growing concern, I would say, or a growing need to answer the question of what we're going to do with our nuclear generating capacities. We have 15 nuclear power blocks, and they are now responsible for more than 50% of energy generation in the country. And again, 10 of them were already extended, their use was extended by 10 years, and they come out of order or out of service already in 2030 and onwards. Every year one block is going to be falling out of the energy system, and that is a question of how we see the substitution of that volume in the strategic perspective, and on one hand side, so which technologies we're going to employ. Either we're going to continue with nuclear or we're going to shift to more renewables, and again, there's going to be this big elephant in the room, which is a lack of balancing capacity. Most of the balancing capacity right now that we have on the electricity market is coming from the coal power plants or coal-fueled power plants, and until we sort out another source of balancing capacity, for example, this winter, it had to be import from Belarus and Russian Federation. There was a part of commercial import as well, which I was fighting against the entire year. Now we just have this technical import, but still it's a big problem for the system. And 25% renewables is probably not such an impossible goal for us. It's challenging, but it's only a question of availability of funding, basically. The biggest problem for our renewable sector right now, I mean, financial, obviously we have an issue of old debts and current payments are made at the level of roughly 70%, 75%, but at the feed-in tariff. We already have some internal discussions in the country of shifting towards the contracts for difference system in the renewable sector, but obviously that is only possible when our markets become competitive and the price is not going to be dictated by manipulations by the traders, which was happening and we were seeing it for the last 2 years since the electricity market started operating. We are also going to be working hard on that, but I think it's the second problem that is limiting the development of renewables is the cost of funding for the country and cost of country risk, even for this type of investment. So currently the loans that are provided for the renewable power plants are quite expensive. And if we can, the government should be working, and if we can work together with our partners from the European Union and the United States to bring this cost of investment lower, that will speed up the process, both refusing the coal generation and building up balancing capacity, as well as new renewable production power plants quite significantly. That's the one very limiting factor right now for Ukrainian energy system. I mean, we also can list the work in progress issues for a very long time. Obviously, one of them being the gas market and the stability of gas supplies. In any case, we won't be able to refuse using gas for quite some time still, and we will need to extend the gas transit agreement anyways. In order to ensure energy security of Ukraine, and not only Ukraine, actually, I see it as a mutual interest for both European Union and Ukraine.
Yeah, Ludmila, could we go pick up some of these points you mentioned? Unless you still have a few points to add.
I have just one point to make that, but in any case, the government and everybody here understands that we need to move to the green economy. We need to be part of European market, and in order to be part of European market with the Green Deal and carbon border adjustment mechanism, we need to adjust both our economy and our energy system. There is a full consensus on that. We need to see which place Ukraine will occupy in the European economy once this transition is made, because I see personally that Ukraine is very, very much capable of becoming like the China of Europe, with much shorter lead times, with improved logistics, and basically the same type of product that can be supplied from Ukraine to the European markets. But obviously all the steps need to be taken in order to ensure that we in this role will be in compliance with the whole Green Deal initiative and all the goals that the Europe sets for all of us.
Okay, thank you for this, bringing the agenda quite broad. I think it was important also in the chat. It was mentioned, I should refer to the chat. There is a couple of questions on gas, on grid refurbishment and nuclear and the CBAM, of course. But, Ludmila, thanks for mentioning also the nuclear part, which we are a little bit, shy of answering, but 50% of the electricity share is a major thing. And unless this gets somehow sorted out, all the rest becomes less traumatic. But could I get back to you on the issue of renewables? And also Luis was mentioning it. very clear in the beginning, actually renewables don't need a lot of support. Now, that was quite a bit of a contrast to your presentation. I understand, Luis, maybe you can clarify a little bit, but I understand that if you have a functioning market, including balancing, I mean, intraday and day ahead, then especially the balancing markets, then actually these renewables can be incorporated at the level of 24% is not dramatic. Grid, of course, is important. So why do you think that you need to continue support this in a sort of somewhat precarious, fiscal position, and also where the consumers probably are not super keen on paying more for the electricity? And maybe also, Luis, afterwards, you may want to have a few suggestions. And then Ed, we should come, to Ed again to come up with some of the points he started to discuss. Lumila, and then
first of all, I 100% agree with Luis, because I was working on the European markets from 2012 till 2018, and I know how in a well-structured, well-functioning market, renewables, that was the period when the zero bids started to appear on this market, etc. So for now, right now, that's true that renewables don't need such a big financial support. We need to obviously resolve historical issues, because we have around 20 billion hryvnia historical debt to renewable energy producers. But moving forward, that's why I said that we are already discussing that if needed, renewables can come to this contracts for difference scheme. However, for that to happen, as you rightly said, Christian, we need well-functioning markets, intraday, balancing market, day ahead, and bilateral. We currently don't have competitive markets. Let's be honest, we have a lot of uncompetitive abuses and breaches of competition law. I will even spotted a couple of deals with a clear, price fixing and cartel agreements. So that all exists still, unfortunately, on the market. And that's why our already long overdue obligation under the association agreement with the European Union that we're trying to bring to life, and this is my this year's objective, to finalize the remit regulations into Ukrainian legislation, because that will start the process of being able to, regulate the markets in such a way that we don't have those abuses, so we can let renewables on the market with the market price, and they can be competitive there as well. Okay. Cost of funding still remains an issue compared to Europe. So even with well-functioning markets, and there is a huge opposition especially from the industrial sector to see any growth of the price for electricity, but in a civilized way, when the other issues will be resolved, that one is going to be the last one to consider. We still have a lot of disbalances that are caused by subsidies to the population, so the subsidized price for the population. And here we either need to kind of, recognize that our people cannot pay more, so we just directly pay from the budget, because all the other kind of PSO mechanisms, they create more, obscurity, and it becomes not clear how much is paid to whom. So the system loses its transparency completely.
Yeah. We put this, Ludmila, we put this onto your remit for this year, if you want to take this challenge up again. Now, Luis, what would you, I know you're from the energy roadmap people, from the renewables roadmap people, but still, I'm sure you're working also on how to integrate renewables the best way. What would you suggest to the Ukraine? And then I would like to go to Ed, who is typing an answer to one of the questions. Thank you for that. And please pick up on the chat. There are some very, very interesting comments and questions. But then Ed, you took a little bit a more bleak perspective than Ludmila on Ukraine and the transition. But you also were a bit more positive on gas. So why can we learn something from the gas for the rest? But first we go to Luis.
Yes, thank you. I think Ludmila put it very well. With regards to, let's say, why still renewables need support in some markets. If what we model is cost, and we compare cost of renewables versus cost of possible fossil alternatives, and we see that these costs are competitive, and we also see it in multiple other markets, as it was mentioned before, where there's sufficient competition that the need for support is phasing out. But of course, there's a big if to that, and is the cost of capital, which in the case of renewables is like the kryptonite of the renewables. This is because renewables are basically capital. And so once you do the investment, you are captive of it, and basically the cost competitiveness of the project depends to a great extent on the cost of capital. And actually, a 1% increase in the cost of capital does not result in 1% increase in the cost of renewables. It is rather 10 times a 10% increase in cost of renewables. So it's extremely important. And this leads me to your question on what advice would you give without. I'm no, let's say, policy design expert, but what I can say is what should be the key objective of all policies and regulations, I think, at least in my perspective, and is think walk the shoes of an investor and think those things that could create a risk for the investors are the bottlenecks and the breaking points for actual deployment of renewables. That's I think the key element, and let's say related to the cost of capital also, which I think is one of the main barriers.
Thank you. Ed, is there something we can learn from the gas for the other part of the energy sector? Or any other question? There was also a question you were trying to answer in the chat, please. You are muted, Ed.
I muted myself to listen carefully to this. There are lots of points, good points that have been brought up that then I have time to comment on. So let me just pick a few. With all due respect to Ludmila, this is not the time for cautious steps for Ukraine. Ukraine has taken 30 years of cautious steps that at best can be charitably called a zigzag path to energy reform. This is the time to commit to a bold energy reform rather than timid steps. And with all due respect, Ukraine is not China. China is big enough to set its own rules and perform, I might say, superbly within its own rules. It's big enough to do that. I mean, the analogy for Ukraine is probably more Poland than China, it seems to me. So, the question of economic poverty is a serious one that needs to be addressed. But my reaction to that is that the long-term solution to energy poverty is economic growth. It's not by continuing kind of this market distortions that we've seen, including in the last 2 years. The energy sector has been a drag on economic growth in Ukraine when it should be a major contributor to high economic growth. For that, it requires a political commitment for systemic change in the energy market that I'm sorry to say, Judge, looking from a distance, we haven't yet seen. At the same time, the population and Ludmila's generation demands it. You know, the Maidan was called Euro Maidan for a reason. Ukrainians want to be part of Europe, even if those ordinary citizens may not know the details on how to accomplish that. That is the job of political leadership, which we have not yet seen. It seems to me that energy security will come to Ukraine when its energy markets and business practices are finally modernized and fully integrated into Europe. It has to be anchored within European practices. That's the standard to aspire to. And energy transition will also allow Ukraine to be seen in Europe as an asset on energy transition rather than the liability that it has been seen for energy security in the last 30 years. So how to turn a weakness into a strength, how to turn threats into opportunities is the challenge of Ukraine. And I can see no better way of doing that than to anchoring itself into Europe. What's more, as I said, you know, CBAM is going to come, and it's a clear and present danger to the Ukrainian economy, and it needs to be addressed. So I see great, as always with Ukraine, you see great potential, but also the regrettable lack of progress towards that potential.
Thank you very much, Ed. Ludmila, if you allow me, I will give you the floor later to comment on these again. There may be other points mentioned. There was also this question in the chat about the CBAM. Ed, in a way, mentioned it. It will come in some form. The question was to Matteo. I don't know whether you want to address this, probably not, but it should be seen, you know, first of all, as a kind of a carrot and stick at the same time, or some call it a sleeping gun. So, you know, there might be, or there will be a possibility to avoid it if this is what the plan is, but then it will include conditionality. And that conditionality will most likely to be discussed. And on top of it will be, of course, market and many, many other things. I don't know in the end what the European Commission or the EU will put into that conditionality basket to discuss, but it will come. And, you know, if I take the points further from Ed, this will be one of the elements, and there will be other conditionalities coming as we go. There were lots of points as well, Kirsten. I wanted to give you the floor to check whether you want to add something on some of the points in the chat, some of the other points. I'm cautious of, you know, I'm anxious of time. We have another 10 minutes or so. So please, Kirsten.
I try to be brief, and I actually was very grateful that you gave me the task to look into the prospects, because I just made my final remarks on the market reforms and the stable regulatory framework, because I think it's much easier for Ed Chow from the US perspective to point to that than coming from the German side and pointing to this points, which indeed sometimes provide more liability than asset for the European market. But still, I think we've seen significant zigzag progress. I think, and we have to see more, because I would really like to underline what Matteo Governatori said. I think to see natural gas, to see gas as a necessary transition fuel in Ukraine for transforming the coal regions, but then also going on with clean gases and then bioenergy, as it has been mentioned. I clearly think that heating is, this highlighting on heating is extremely important, but it comes with major challenges, as we also see in West Europe. So I think we have to look into big capital intensive sectors where we can really make a quick and rapid change with investments, and not so much into the end consumers, which indeed are necessary for certainly the market reforms that Ludmila has pointed to. My final point is, and this was in the chat as well, and I keep saying that don't overlook this issue of electricity and electrification. And I mentioned synchronization, but I think the first step is interconnectivity. And this is important because we're seeing the major challenges with the imports, the technical imports that you mentioned from Belarus and Russia. And this will, of course, be a major challenge in the way ahead. So this, I think we have to concentrate and talk much more on the energy security challenges in the electricity sector.
Thank you, thank you, Kirsten. Maybe if this is fine, I would go back to Ludmila. There were a couple of points you may want to respond, but before, let me also add on that there was in the chat that as long as imports, technical imports from Russia and Belarus continue, the synchronization will be very, very difficult. You have to, you can't have it both ways in a way. And if I read some of the discussion, if I want to be a bit indiscreet, correctly, I think there was a little bit of in Ukraine having it by both ways. So there probably needs to be a choice to be made. And also maybe in your closing comments, I understand this is a whole package, which you also outlined. And I'm sure there's many, many elements to the package. You could have gone for another 10 minutes easily to outline the other packages. But the complications for me seems to be you have either the full package or nothing. You cannot just pick some parts which are a little bit easier than the other. So it has to go, markets deliver renewables, and then a regulatory framework delivers lower capital cost, etc., etc. Synchronization, cannot allow you access to Russian and Belarusian electricity, but gets you into another field. So all this full package. So, maybe at the end, if you would like also to share a little bit with us what you would think is really the priority areas to get going, to avoiding this future zigzagging. And as you know, the more time you lose, the more difficult it gets. And I think this is a little bit the understanding. So, Ludmila, please.
Yeah, you are absolutely right about imports. And for the last 1.5 years, I was very actively trying to fight the possibility of Russian and Belarusian import of electricity, which is even yet more surprising that the European the Energy Secretariat is of a different opinion, that we need limited imports from Russia and Belarus as long as it's justified by technical or market need, because for some reason they see it as a competitive point to add to a otherwise quite monopolized market, which I couldn't disagree more with, but now we already have provisions in the law that allow our regulator to limit imports from Russia and Belarus or stop them as such. So we have finally resolved the problem that was actually created not so long ago. And hopefully now we will be trying to reduce the imports as much as possible. But coming back to what Mr. Cho said, and I absolutely, again, couldn't agree more that we need very quick and decisive steps rather than timid attempts to put the markets right. The real problem is that Ukraine currently is at war and in the middle of a very difficult hybrid war for the energy system and energy independence with our eastern neighbor. Militarily, together with our Western partners, we were able to, at least the most recent attack and the grouping of Russian army under the Ukrainian borders, we were able to together, influence Russia to withdraw their influence there. Unfortunately, it didn't happen yet in the energy sector in our country. So there are lots of internal actors who would, basically put the discourse and narrative about prices for electricity and natural gas to such a high stance in the country that it does create political instability whenever, a growth of tariffs is being discussed. And the only way to come out of it is economic growth, that's for sure. But the way we should go through right now in order to achieve normal market conditions is to fight all those actors who are fighting not for Ukrainian energy independency, like we did with gas market. And we already have this very good example of joint work for the unbundling of the gas transportation system and launching reverse supplies of natural gas. So the same importance right now should be given to the electricity market, because if gas market is a political element for Russia right now, electricity market becomes such a political element. And given that Russia is controlling all the nuclear fuel supplies, and as I said, it is responsible for 50% of electricity generation in the country, that is the area we, I think, need to prioritize and concentrate on. Obviously, other areas are not less important, but they can be dealt with in a due course. The biggest attack we see right now is on the electricity market. Here, I mean, all the market abuses we have seen, all the price fixing between government owned companies and private traders and private companies. We see a lot of political influence on this market right now. That needs to be admitted, and unless we can remove this political influence and really make the rules and stick to them, we will be unfortunately making very timid steps. On the other hand side, Ministry of Energy right now doesn't have authority to influence the sector as such, because they're not controlling most of the state-owned generation, electricity generation, such as Energoatom and Hydro. They're not controlling coal generation. They're not controlling Ukrenergo, the TSO operator, and they only see some of the market, and yet they cannot regulate them thoroughly, of the market operator, so they can see what's happening on day ahead and intraday market. Basically, those are the only competences that are left within the Ministry of Energy. So that is right now a sole responsibility of the government and officially the government who can influence this. Obviously, then there are also unofficial influences that needs to be taken into consideration. So if there will be a willingness from the side of our European partners and American partners to pay as much attention to the electricity market now as we did a couple of years back to the gas market, I think together we can achieve the same ambitious results and remove this undue political influence on the market.
Thank you. I saw Matteo nodding, so you have his support. It's probably a little bit, yes, a little bit easier said than done, but that's a clear concluding statement. And as we run out of time, I would like to conclude here. I picked up 3 main points. Let me repeat them here. Ludmila, you made very clear in the beginning, there is now a consensus to go to green markets. The decarbonisation is real. It needs to happen. Now, the second point is, however, if it's more than a lip service, it is important, instrumental or indispensable that Ukraine moves as fast as possible to a market. And you mentioned all the obstacles there exist. And of course, the first starting point, Ed has mentioned it and others have mentioned it alongside as well. There needs to be a political commitment to be sticking to that. Now, once we're there, there is a number of, I would say, immediate activities to be done. Electricity market, the first one, as you mentioned, but also you need to find a solution to the nuclear, 50% of the power sector. In a market, you have to handle it somehow. It's underinvestment for many, many years. It's underinvestment, it's undercapitalized. So that is no small fry either. The renewables have been there, huge potential, but again, functioning markets are important to unlock the capital, to unlock the investment, be it international, be it Ukrainian. And then heating, you mentioned there, is an issue. Maybe it is a little bit less urgent from a sort of a market perspective, maybe differently from a political.
It's just gonna be the same difficult process to launch heating market as it was to launch gas market, and the same challenge, number of challenges to overcome that we now have on the electricity market. But it's with a functioning electricity market, it's going to be much easier to reform heating sector because then we would be sure that the price level for electricity to which we're proposing our population to switch is going to be competitive to other sources of energy. So it's kind of the foundation.
It's the foundation, but I've seen a lot in Southeast European countries how difficult the connection between the heating markets and the electricity markets is, especially if they are to some extent end consumer prices are regulated, which in very politicized situation usually is the case, and then then there's arbitrage between the two, doesn't make it easier. So, but we appreciate your ambition, and you have until the end of the year, if you have declared to at least to sort it out with your colleagues in government. So let me finish here. I think we have identified some of the key points. I would like to thank all the speakers and participants for joining in what has now become almost a series of meetings on Ukraine. So I'm sure we will continue further, and maybe, Ludmila, we connect in January again and see how far we have come then. So I would like now to finish the meeting. So thank you very much for joining, attending, and have a good afternoon. And Ed, have a good day. Your day is still ahead of you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.